All right, so let's start with the agenda. What we're going to talk about first, because this workshop is about talking about fat phobia. And so we're going to start with all the stuff in the background, the stuff that we need to think about and consider before we can really get our snappy comebacks going. And then we'll talk about response options, and we're going to do some general response options and some specific situation options. And then we'll get into the Q&A when you can ask any questions that you might have. So starting with things to maybe consider when responding. The first is your relationship to the person you're talking to and power that they might have over you. And again, it's your call whether or not to consider these things, but sometimes we're in a situation where if we respond to someone, their reaction can have a real negative impact on our lives. And so those are things that we might want to take into account, whether it's a parent that we live with or someone that we rely on for support, that kind of thing. A doctor in a situation where we can't maybe find another doctor, we may have to decide how we want to respond based on that dynamic and that power dynamic and relationship. And that's completely our call and completely valid. And so that gets into possible consequences when we think about, okay, if I respond to this fat phobia in this way, like what are the possible consequences, and how do I feel about that? And again, that's always going to be our call, but it's something to think about. And then intent. And again, this is a maybe kind of thing. Impact is always greater than intent. And Deb Regard was the person who first gave me the metaphor of someone stepping on your foot in the elevator. So if I'm in an elevator and I step on your foot and you say, ow, you're hurting me, and I say, well, I didn't intend to, that's not nearly as helpful as if I stop stepping on your foot and then in the future I'm more cautious about where I step in an elevator, right? But we can decide that intent matters. So we can decide that someone being well-meaning warrants a different response from us, or we can decide that it doesn't. That's always going to be our call. Privilege is a huge part of this, and I'm dividing this into two types of privilege. So cultural privilege are things that we get based on systemic oppression and marginalization. So I have a tremendous amount of white privilege, and that's going to affect every interaction I have, including when I'm speaking up against fat phobia. As someone with able-bodied privilege, as someone with neurotypicality privilege, cisgender privilege, those are all things that are going to come into play. And so it's important that we know that, and also that we think about how we can use that privilege. So when I do a lot of activism, a lot of times it's because I realize I have this privilege. So if I use that privilege and, take a stand against what's happening, then maybe the next person who comes along who doesn't have as much privilege doesn't have to take that stand, doesn't have to do that. And then there's personality privilege. And this is something that I think about a lot because I talk about responding to fat phobia. I talk about the snappy comebacks, and what's important to know about that is that a lot of that is like luck of the draw stuff and privilege stuff. I happen to be someone who, when I'm confronted, I get very clear-headed and clear thinking. And, all the stats that I ever knew come right to me. I become very calm in that moment. I'm also somebody who doesn't happen to cry when I'm upset. And there's nothing in the world wrong with crying when you're upset. That's a completely reasonable reaction. But because of the way our culture is, I can have a better response because I don't happen to be someone who cries. And so again, that's all stuff that's sort of luck of the draw and privilege, and it's important to understand that. And so each of us have to find ways to navigate this that work for who we are and that unfortunately are going to be influenced by things outside of our control in terms of the way that we're oppressed, marginalized, and the ways that we're privileged. So let's start with, if something happens, some kind of fat phobia comes at you, and for whatever reason you don't want to or you can't reply out loud, you still have options. The first thing you can do is acknowledge the situation silently. Right? So the thing happens and you think to yourself, okay, this is fat phobia. This is definitely fat phobia. And it's helpful and important a lot of times just to name that. Like, this is happening. It's not in my head. It's real. It shouldn't be happening. I should not be having to deal with this in this moment. You can also come up with a kind of neutral phrase that you use where you know what it means, but maybe the other person doesn't. Some examples are, oh, thanks for that. So someone says, oh, you shouldn't be eating that. Oh, thanks for that. Having lived in Texas for 17 years, I'm a big fan of bless your heart. Oh, bless your heart. Bless your heart for saying that. Thank you. And that just gives you a little power in the situation without having to respond out loud or directly. And then it can also help to play it out later. So when you get back to your house, to your car, some time alone, either thinking through or saying out loud what you wanted to say, but for whatever reason didn't want to or couldn't, can also help process through that information. And again, totally valid if you choose not to respond. That's reasonable. That's often what you'll choose for a lot of reasons. But having a plan so that you can be okay within yourself from that interaction, which again, never should have happened to you, can be really helpful. So as I've been alluding to, any response that we choose to fat phobia is going to be valid, and responding is not an obligation. So our response to either the same type of fat phobia or fat phobia coming from the same person might change on a day-to-day or hour-to-hour basis, depending on our own energy level, how we're feeling, what's going on in the rest of the world and how that's affecting us, how many times this has happened, either from this person or like today, and what we want to deal with. So if we know that that person's going to come back with a big defensive reaction and we don't feel like dealing with that at that time, that's completely valid. And that another option is to go into our, what we just learned about when we don't want to respond directly. So the choices that we make on how we're dealing with the oppression that we experience are valid and are our own, and we can choose different responses at different times. So I have both responded to fat phobia and played Carnegie Hall, and I have been successful with the same strategy, which was practicing. Practicing for the fat phobia that we experience can help incredibly because it helps to ratchet down our response. So if something comes at us out of the blue and we're not ready for it, then we will tend to have more of an adrenaline response. We will tend to be more flustered. But if we are like, nope, I knew this was coming, I practiced for it, it can be really helpful. And so practice can be something that you do in your head. It can be a role play that you do with someone else. It can be something that you write out. And it can be, in preparation for an event. If you know that when you go to a family holiday, there's likely to be fat phobia happening, food shaming, that kind of thing, you can get ready for that and practice. If you know you're going to the doctor and this might be an issue, you can get ready for that and try to practice. And again, the burden isn't on us. This shouldn't be happening. But in terms of what we can do to improve our situation, practicing is an option there. All right, let's get to the responses. So we're going to start with all-purpose responses, and we're going to do this like California frozen yogurt, which is that sometimes you just want the flavor that you get. So for example, maybe the flavor is Rocket Pop, and it doesn't need any help because it's just delicious on its own. Or sometimes maybe it's vanilla, and it needs some like mix-ins to make it right. And so we'll start with the main flavor, and then I'll give you some mix-in options. So the first response is that laughter is the best medicine, by which I mean straight laugh in someone's face. So when someone comes up to you and says, at your size, you really shouldn't wear horizontal stripes, you respond. Usually people aren't ready for that, and it can be disarming. In terms of mix-ins, you can add the head shake. You can add the be gone hand. And you can add the word no. No. And I have found that it can help to say it like you might say to a dog that you are training, just to be real clear about the boundary. So that's the first option. Just laugh at them. Next option is to say, I'm not soliciting advice. So somebody says to you, with your face shape, you just shouldn't have hair that short. You say, I'm not actually soliciting advice about my hair. And again, this isn't something that people typically are used to, and so it can create that kind of pause and make them stop. For mix-ins, you can do adjectives. I'm not soliciting random advice from fatphobic people. You can do, I can't imagine. I can't imagine what made you think it was okay to say that, but I'm not soliciting advice about my hair from random fatphobic strangers. And again, no. So they say, at your size, you really shouldn't have hair that short. No. I'm not soliciting advice from strangers about my hair. So again, these are all options to kind of put somebody off and set that boundary and get them to move on with their life. This one I have found really, really successful because people are not ready for it, I have found. So somebody says, that's really too much ice cream in your grocery cart. I have no interest in your opinion. And then just kind of stand there and slow blink until they wander off. If you want to be especially kind, you can say, oh, thanks, but I have no interest in your opinion. If they aren't getting the hint, you can say, I have no interest in your opinion. Move along. And if they start talking again, you can simply interrupt them. I have no interest in your opinion. Oh, I was just saying, no, seriously, no interest at all. So to all purpose for different reasons, if I want to start a dialogue with someone, or I want them to arrive at the fact that they've been fat phobic by having to explain what they're doing, I tend to use the phrase, help me understand. Help me understand why you thought it was okay to, tell me your opinion about my horizontal stripes. Help me understand why you thought I would want you to comment on my hair. Help me understand why you thought I wanted your opinion about my groceries. And this invites dialogue. And so if you don't want dialogue, it's probably not a great option. But in the same way that when someone tells me a joke that's based on oppression, a racist joke, an anti-Semitic joke, a fatphobic joke, I will simply say, I don't get it. Can you explain it? I don't get it. What's funny about that? Until they get to the point that they have to be clear that this is just based on racism or fatphobia or anti-Semitism, et cetera. And so this help me understand, I sort of use in the same way so that they can kind of talk themselves into being clear that like this interaction was not appropriate. And it's possible that they won't get there. And that's important to know as well. They may feel like, oh, well, I just care about your health. Help me understand why you think my health is your business, or I should care what you think about my health. So you can kind of keep going with that, but it invites a dialogue. On the other end of the spectrum, if a situation has gone so incredibly sideways that I literally can't even believe what's happening and can't formulate a response, I will simply interrupt and say, I'm going to stop you there. And let that give me a second to breathe and to think about what response I might have next. So I might, somebody might be saying something so ridiculous to me, it's so out of left field, I so did not anticipate it, that I just can't even think of a response. And so I'll just say, wait, I'm going to stop you there. And if they keep talking, no, I'm going to stop you there. And I just keep repeating that until I have enough space to be like, yeah, I'm not soliciting opinions about my health, or whatever response I'm going to go into. But I find those two to be pretty good kind of all-purpose responses for either end of the spectrum of fatphobia that we deal with. All right, now getting into more of the friends and family kind of situation. So with friends and family, I find a 3-step boundary setting process can be really helpful. So I will start with setting the boundary. And you can explain it if you want, or you can just set the boundary. This behavior is no longer acceptable to me. Preferably, I find it works best if you do this in a neutral moment. So if you know that when you go home for, your grandma's birthday every year, there's going to be shaming about your food choices, instead of doing it at the birthday party when there's already all of this stuff going on, you can do it at a separate, time and a more neutral moment. And then the second step is to explain the consequence. So in terms of choosing the consequence, we got to focus on our own behavior and choices. I can't make other people act right, unfortunately, but I can choose my own behavior. So it might be something like, I'll leave the room, I'll leave the party, you won't be able to spend time with my kids if you're gonna, be fatphobic around them, that kind of thing. The key is to make sure that this is something that you can follow through with. So if you say, if you do this again, I am never speaking to you, and that's not actually something that you're wanting to do, then it's not as effective, because what that person is going to end up learning from the situation, unfortunately, is that your boundaries and consequences aren't really real to them. And it's not as empowering of a situation, which is what I think is more important. So picking something, it can be the smallest consequence. I have found that a lot of times people think it has to be a huge consequence or it won't be effective, but really I have found small consequences for me and for people who I've, coached through this and who have used it are incredibly effective. And then the third step is just to follow through. So if the thing happens after you've said that it was unacceptable, you told the consequence, you reiterate why it's happening and follow through. So to take an example, let's take the grandma's birthday dinner. So, you're in a neutral moment. Hey, in a couple weeks, I know I'm going to be coming in for grandma's birthday. I know every year there's a lot, you talk a lot about like what I eat and my, food choices. And I know you mean well, but that's harmful to me. And so that can't happen anymore. And so if there is a comment on what I'm eating, I'm just going to take my food, to the living room and eat, and I'll just, eat by myself. And then if you're at the party and there's a comment on your food, you say, okay, like I said, this isn't behavior that's acceptable anymore. So I'm just going to take my plate and go into the other room. We can try again next year. And it's important to understand that at this point, people will often get defensive and try to blame it. I can't believe you're ruining grandma's birthday. Oh, I can't believe that you couldn't, keep a simple request, that you couldn't respect a simple boundary, that you couldn't not comment negatively on my food. That's really unfortunate. I'm sorry that, you left me with no other options. So we can be ready to kind of deflect that back. What I and other folks that I've talked to who have done this have found is that often you only have to follow through that one time and the behavior will change. Now, your mileage may vary. This might not work in every situation, and different families are different based on family dynamic and culture, a lot of different things. But this can be something to try. And of course, as with all of these things, you can modify it to make sense to you. The words that you'd use, your family communication and culture, all of that is changeable based on yourself and your family. So moving on to the workplace. So if you're dealing with coworkers and they're engaging in diet talk, fat phobic talk, we have some options. The first is to talk about your non-diet practice the same way that they talk about their diets, right? So if they're talking all the time about points, what they can and can't eat, how much they're eating, you can talk about, oh, since doing health at every size, it's just been so much more peaceful. I don't have to do math just to have lunch. I just, enjoy my food and nourish my body, and it's just amazing. And you can just kind of add that conversation in. You can change the subject. I know someone who memorized a bunch of facts about monkeys. And so every time somebody in her office said something food shaming or fat phobic, she would just come through with a random monkey fact. And it was so startling that it just broke the situation, and then she could move on or change the subject. But it doesn't have to be monkey facts, but changing the subject is completely reasonable in these situations. Depending on your workplace and your culture, your relationship with your coworkers, you can also set a boundary. And you can just say, hey, you know what? I'm working on my relationship with food and my body. And this kind of talk really makes that tough. So, would you mind if when we go to lunch, we don't talk about this kind of stuff? Like, there's a lot of other stuff to talk about. And see if that can kind of change the focus. And again, you can go back to that 3-step boundary setting. You can't make your coworkers talk about things that aren't fat phobic, unfortunately, but you can say, you know what, like I said, this is with the work that I'm doing on my relationship with food and my body, this is just really harmful to me. So I'm going to go ahead and eat lunch, at my desk or at a different place or whatever. And again, your culture will determine a lot of like what is possible here and what will work here, and that's never our fault. Fat phobia that comes at us, it becomes our problem, but it's never our fault. And so the ways that we have to deal with it within the system are also not our fault, and I think that's really important to constantly remember. When someone self-shames, so someone is saying fat phobic stuff about themselves, uh, in a work context or even in another context, some options are global statements. So you can just say, I wish we lived in a world where we just appreciated all bodies. Or I wish we lived in a world where, people could just eat what they wanted and feel comfortable about that or whatever. So you're not directing it at that person necessarily and making them uncomfortable, but you're also like making a broader statement about it. You can share your own feelings. Oh, I used to feel that same way. And, I can give you the resources that I found if you ever want, but, just know that there are other options out there. Or set a boundary, again, focusing on your behavior. Oh, you know what? I totally respect that that's how you feel, but in terms of the work that I'm doing on my relationship with food and my body, this isn't talk that I can really be around. So I'm just going to go over there. So, again, those are all options. If your workplace has a weight loss initiative, some things you can say either to HR, to the person who's coordinating it, to other people to kind of get them thinking, I'm really not comfortable with my boss and coworkers monitoring my body. Or I'm very uncomfortable that my employer has a point of view at all about my body size, and I'm afraid this is causing workplace discrimination and a hostile work environment. Or I'm really concerned about the ways that this might harm people who have or who could get an eating disorder. And I personally have recovered from an eating disorder, so I would use my personal story there. But even if you haven't, that's something that you can talk about, and there are lots of resources about that. And then provide an option. Maybe we could just focus on, joyful movement, or maybe we could focus on, hydration or getting more sleep. And it's important to know too that often workplaces, when they talk about health and wellness, they want to focus on what each individual person is eating or how much they're exercising, but they don't want to focus on the fact that they don't give adequate vacation time, that they don't give adequate pay, that they don't give adequate options for moving and enjoying, food, because people are expected to be working so hard so much. And so those are things that you can bring up too. Let's talk about wellness. Let's talk about what the research says about vacation time and pay levels and how that uh, associates with wellness. Let's talk about how oppression harms wellness and how we could be doing anti-racism work within this company to help people's wellness, how we could be doing anti-homophobia and transphobia work. And so you can also shift the conversation to those things. If you are communicating with HR, there's a couple of things that I have found that have been pretty helpful in terms of phrasing. The first is something like, yeah, this team weight loss challenge goes against the health plan that I created with my doctor. And that puts me in a position between my healthcare practice and looking like I'm not a team player at work. How would you suggest I navigate that? And again, that invites conversation, but it also makes it clear that not everybody, this isn't healthy or safe for everybody, really for anybody, but let's just say for everybody for the sake of this conversation, right? Or, it's my understanding that studies show that the vast majority of people who attempt weight loss gain their weight back, and many gain back more. So could you show me the evidence that you're using for the efficacy of this wellness program? And a super helpful resource here is a blog called They Said What? The Wellness Industry's Pants Are on Fire. And you can find it at this website, dismgmt.wordpress.com. And it's all about the wellness industry and how crap it is. It's run by a guy named Al Lewis, who's a phenomenal resource in this area. And so I definitely recommend that in terms of sending evidence. All right, moving on to at the doctor's office. So this can be a really difficult place because there's a definite power imbalance here. Sometimes we need something from that doctor. We need a prescription refill. We need a referral. We need them to be on our team, and often they're not. So one option is to call ahead. And I like this because you can do it anonymously. I've done it for other people. I've done it for myself, and just say, yeah, I practice health at every size, so I'm looking for a doctor who can provide weight neutral health care. So that means they wouldn't prescribe diets or weight loss. They would, work with my body size and, provide care that's weight neutral. And often they'll have to get back to you, but in my experience, they do get back to you and they will tell you the truth. Like I've had them call back and say, nope, the doctor said he absolutely will not do that. Great, thank you. And so again, this can be done anonymously, so you've done nothing to damage your relationship with this doctor by making this call. And sometimes they'll say this doctor will, this doctor won't, but at least you've gotten that done ahead of time. And if they say yes, then you say, okay, great. Will you put that in my chart and make sure that that's respected when I get there? Now, that is no guarantee that they will respect it, but at least you've created the baseline there. So when you get in, check in, remind the receptionist, hey, I had called ahead and was promised weight neutral care. So if you can just make a note of that to, the nurse and the doctor. So then we move in, and whether or not you've done that, there's a very good chance that they're going to try to get you to weigh in. And so you are not required to do this. I'm hearing more and more healthcare practitioners say, oh, insurance requires it, but I can find no proof of that. Insurance prefers it, but that's not the same thing as requiring, and we have a right to refuse any kind of medical intervention. So technically the doctor could refuse to treat us, and that's important to know. But in general, I have found that if I push back a little, they will let this go. And the reason I choose not to be weighed in is because I have found that when the doctor has a number, it really activates their fat phobia more than just seeing me in front of them. And that may be a privileged thing as well, so your mileage may vary, but that has been my experience. So what I found works best is I'm walking behind the nurse, points to the scale, and I say, no, thank you, and keep walking. At that point, they have to come get me because you're not allowed to just wander around in the doctor's office by yourself. So they have to leave the scale, come and get me, and usually they will just use that momentum to take me right to the room we're supposed to go to. Or if I want to explain, I'll say, you know what, if it becomes medically necessary, if we have a prescription and need my weight, then I'll absolutely be willing to do a weigh-in. But for now, no, thank you. And even if you choose to weigh in or there's some reason where you do need to weigh in, you can say, I would like to be weighed facing away from the scale, and I would like to not be told my number. Please make a note of that in big print. So that's also your right. And then when I'm talking to the doctor and they're saying something based on a stereotype that doesn't fit my personal situation, I will explain that, and then I will use a phrase like, I really need you to practice medicine and not stereotyping. One of the perhaps funniest times this happened, I am somebody who likes doing ridiculous sportsy things. And to be clear, fitness is not an obligation barometer of worthiness, and running a marathon and having a Netflix marathon are morally equivalent activities. But I was training for my first marathon. I had done an 18-mile training run the night before. And so I'm in the doctor's office, and the doctor says to me, you know, I need you to do something, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be so hard. But I'm telling you, if you can just do it, it's going to change so much in your life. And I'm sitting there like, what could this be, right? And he says, I just need you to start walking 10 minutes a day. And I was like, I mean, I'm happy to do that to cut down. Like that would save a lot of my time, but I don't think either of us are going to get what we want out of that, right? But and so there I was like, you know, it sounds like you're making assumptions. You never asked me about my movement at all. So, you know, I'm really going to need you to practice medicine and not stereotyping. And just that little bit of shame can be helpful. So in the appointment, some phrasing that I have found, this sort of magic phrase that I have found is, do thin people get this issue? And what do you prescribe for them? And the answer is almost always yes. They're not typically expecting this question necessarily. And a lot of times doctors want to provide information. So when I ask, what do you prescribe for them? They just want to give it to me because they want to, you know, give me this information. So I found that to be really helpful. And then say, well, let's try that first. You know, let's try that and see what happens. You might also say something like, you know, my previous doctor showed me studies that almost everyone regains their weight and most people gain back more than they lost. So it sounds like the most likely outcome of what you're prescribing is weight gain. And I think I'd rather just treat the health issue and then go, you know, thin people get this, right? So what do you do for them? In a situation where you are needing this doctor to help you. So for example, I live in Los Angeles. So if I upset a doctor, there are 10 more doctors I can go to. And because of that, and a combination of my privilege, I go hard in the doctor's office. I want them to remember how uncomfortable this conversation was, because I want them to think about that the next time they're going to say this to somebody else. So I'm always willing to get fired by a doctor. I'm willing to fire a doctor. And again, that's a lot of privilege that goes into that. But my use of that privilege is, I'm going to make this uncomfortable. The next time that this doctor has a fat patient in front of them, I want them to remember how miserable this appointment was. And so, you know, those are options for me. But for a lot of people, like if you live rurally and there's only one or two doctors, or if your insurance is very, tightly bound and you only have a certain number of practitioners you can go to, one option is to lie. And I always want to be clear, lying to our doctors is dangerous, and it sucks that they put us in this position. But sometimes it's what we need to do to get the health care we need. So we'll say, oh yeah, no, I've been on a diet. I've already lost 30 pounds, but it hasn't changed this at all. So can we, do thin people get this? Can we try those treatments while I continue to lose weight? I haven't lost 30 pounds. I have no intention of losing any other weight. But what I'm trying to get is the kind of evidence-based healthcare that a thin person would get just for walking in the door. Right? Or you might say, this diet, sounds amazing. I can't wait to try it. But it says here, I'm going to be losing 1 to 2 pounds a week. So it sounds like that's going to take a long time. And like, I have this health issue right now. So could we maybe do whatever it is you do that you're planning to do once I lose the weight starting now? And then, I'll go ahead and do this diet. So you can kind of fib that way. I absolutely will go to this seminar about stomach amputation. But, in the meantime, can I possibly, just get some treatment like whatever you'd give a thin person with this problem. And so we may be stuck in a situation where that is the option that we have to take to get competent healthcare, and that sucks. But that's just the situation because the medical system is so incredibly fatphobic. So That is the talk part. So now we're going to move into the Q&A. I'm going to leave the screen up for just a couple seconds so that you can write down my email. If there's anything that you don't want to ask in the Q&A but you would like to ask me directly, you can always just email me. If you think of something later, email me. I'm always very happy to answer these emails. It is a joy of my life to get to do this work. So totally in for that. All right, and I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to stop the recording.